No, that's not what I said. I'm pretty sure you misunderstood me. Today on the Manspace. Welcome to the Manspace podcast. We're your hosts, Doctors Matt Brown and Rob Porter, and clinical therapist Mike Porter. Welcome, spacemen. Pulling a mic all of a sudden. Dude, I just had a client. I was trying to think, what episode are they referencing where it said, it texted me in all caps and it said, "I'm not phobic, I just don't agree with you." And I was like, what are they talking about? And then it said hashtag spaceman. It's like, what's happening? I don't understand what's happening.
I think it was telling your kids no. I think it was something I said.
That Mike's like, you're phobic.
That like,
a lot
of
because
kids will
say
like, if I disagree with them, well, you must be, like some kind of
phobic. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, I just don't agree with you. So, yeah.
Well, here we should have been recording all that stuff. We could just plug that in here. The continuing saga of, dude,
Matt's
my internet was fine last time. I know I kept freezing on you guys, but it was fine. Like when I watched.
Well, on your end, yeah, right?
Yeah. We'll see. It won't happen again because Matt and I are sitting here together, and Mike's internet is like from God himself. He's touching the very laptop.
You're all kind of digitized.
Well, that's on you.
Both of us?
No, just Rob.
Hey, so there's a certain irony.
Well, we didn't test our theory, dude.
I know, and I need to.
We were going to have somebody else host it.
I was just thinking to myself, there's a certain irony in last episode because I said something about you don't like what I'm saying or whatever. Well, that's on you. And here I am saying, my internet was fine. It's on you guys. You screwed up last episode. You guys are funny today.
Long pauses.
I feel like you should tell me something you've been watching or something. Or this is not. We're going to say this isn't relevant, but I told you guys about this, but now I'm going to ask your opinion while the spacemen are listening, because they must know all things that we think at all times. Elon Musk recently posted on his Twitter account on February 28th. Sorry, his X account. Sorry, Senor Musk, for calling it Twitter still. He said, put never went to therapy. Although he put that in, anyway, he said, put never went to therapy on my gravestone.
He was saying, about himself. Yeah.
Yeah, which I guess is, he's bragging?
I guess.
Yeah, my first thought was, and it shows.
He's such a fascinating human. I don't know what to make of that. Yeah. But kudos to you, Elon. I might have to cut all this silence out. You guys are all just staring. I guess we should get going, huh? No meandering today. We're cutting right to it.
Well, you started asking the question, what were we watching?
Yeah.
Nothing. I mean, boring stuff. I've been watching a Canadian show called Hoarder House Flippers.
Is it Hoarder House Flippers, eh?
No, it's actually pretty satisfying, though, because, hoarders at times is satisfying to see a house get cleaned up, but then it just still looks like crap. It's just cleaner. But
now they actually flip it.
They go in and just gut it, and somehow it's like a bunch of different teams of people that work together on like house flipping and stuff. But somehow some of them like convince family members to come clean out this nasty house, and all they give them is a meal. I'm like, and it's also like, you can keep anything you find. It's like, well, sometimes they find some cool stuff, but I remember doing one of those when I was like it's like my first year in college. Maybe I was back on a break, and my dad had a guy that he was friends with that would buy houses like that and turn them into rental houses. But yeah, this one was like, I think we filled like 3 or 4 45-yard dumpsters, and it was like a 3-bedroom Rambler, so maybe like 1,800 square feet,
Yeah.
and it had that much junk in it and in the backyard. Like the previous owners were basically using their backyard as a landfill, and like their neighbors were paying them so that they could just dump their trash
What?
there. I don't know if that was that much cheaper than just or if they didn't have a service or whatever, but yeah, it was nasty. It took me and my friend 4 or 5 days to clean everything out. There was stuff like up in the attic and everywhere you could possibly put stuff. And anyway, so yeah, the Hoarder House Flippers, they
Couldn't come up with a cooler
they
name
buy
though.
these. There was the one, I think the last episode I watched was freaking sweet. It's like the house looked like somebody had just, I don't know, just had open fires nonstop
Oh man.
in the kitchen. And they're like, what is this? They found the person was just straight up like cooking over a fire in the sink.
Dude, actually I haven't thought about this that will springboard us into our topic today, but I do think I watch those shows and I become so paranoid. Like my office lately, I've been like, what can I throw out of my office? I'm sick of having like stuff. I don't want stuff anywhere. I don't want to become the guy where it's like when I'm dead, my kids are like, oh, why do we still have this? And I'm already the guy in my house where my kids make jokes like, you know, if someone's like, I can't find this. And then the answer will be, did dad throw it out? And I'm like, well, did you leave it sitting there? Because I probably did. Like, man, I'm so sick of seeing stuff that I felt bad last night. I walked in, I was in a bad mood. I had heartburn all night.
I'm old. I got heartburn. Our pets' heads are falling off.
It was seriously like the most dad moment that I've had in a long time. That it was like, it wasn't even consistent. I'm like, I don't do that. Why did I do that? So I walked in because my 2 kids didn't do their kitchen jobs 2 nights before. And so they were both just sitting there like they had to do the counters and then load the dishes. And so I came home and my daughter had done the counters, but my other son had not done the dishes. So I walk in and I was like, dude, what are you doing? He's like, working on homework. I was like, okay. He's like, I said, you got to go load the dishes. He said, can I finish first? And I was like, how many questions do you have? You know, blah, blah, blah. And 4. And his tone, he started to shift because I said, okay, but as soon as that's done, you have to go load. He's like, yeah, okay. And that I was like, oh, dude. And so I said, if I come downstairs in the morning, there's dishes in the sink, you're cleaning the entire kitchen by yourself the next night. He's like, yeah, gee, okay, yeah, I got it. Yeah, got it. Fine. And I was like, oh. Because it already happens that like with this particular kid at his age, at this phase of life, like he comes in and the edge of our couch is where everything for him goes. So it's like piling up. There's like 6 sweatshirts because my kids, I mean, I have a picture of my kids walking around. It's like 104 degrees outside and they're all wearing hoodies.
Sweatshirts.
I was like, what the crap is wrong with you guys? But anyway, they're sitting there and then he's got like a brush over on the kitchen table and like a book somewhere and something. There's stuff all over the place that I've asked him 4 times to come clean up and he doesn't. But I'm also not the kind of guy or the kind of dad who's like, okay, well now this is happening. Because I never felt like that was, I don't like that mentality. For me, it doesn't fit. Anyway, that was all a long way of saying.
I was just waiting for you to say, then you like turned into Dragon Dad and spewed your stomach acid heartburn all over him and melted his flesh. Now you're going to wash the dishes.
No, I ended up going to the bathroom. I was showering off because I had to shave my head because I have to get up early for today. So I was showering off and I was like, oh man. So I walked back downstairs like, dude, he's cleaning the dishes. I was like, sorry, man. I came in kind of hot at that. I was just having a bad night. I was grumpy. He's like, oh no, it's cool. I thought it was me. Like I was kind of being a turd. I was like, well, I didn't like the way I was acting. So I'm sorry. He's like, well, me too. He always does that. I was like, I was being bad too. I was like, all right, cool.
Nice.
So it worked out, and yay! But all of that came off of me saying, like, "Can you please get rid of your crap because it's always everywhere." I don't ever like that feeling of stuff cluttering. I don't know how people can live in it. But have you ever?
But here's a perfect product placement, and the reason for Rob's ability to rein it in: Prilosec.
That's true. I tried it this morning, and I think it's already working. Although they say it's totally placebo because it's like it'll take at least a day.
Yeah,
but I feel like $1 million. If anybody's wondering, I've had heartburn for like 2 weeks straight. Not like it comes and goes. It's basically just there. And then sometimes it gets stronger. It's enough that when I wake up at like 3 a.m, I'm like, not necessarily because of heartburn, but I can feel it. And then I'll wake up and be like, what if like the acid is just eating my throat? And eventually I'll go to the doctor and be like, you have no throat. We're going to have to give you a prosthetic throat. Food's just falling from your mouth and kind of plopping into your body.
no exit.
No egress. That's the wrong. So here's my second question. When something like Hoarders comes up in normal conversation, do you guys ever get this thing where like friends will be like, hey, you're a therapist, and therefore they don't say this.
You specialize in hoarding.
You know everything about all mental health.
Yeah.
What do I do for my sister who's a hoarder or something like that? And it's like, I don't know. Like I want to tell people like, that really I specialize in like couples, relationship stuff. Like I know some stuff about that. And probably at some point I taught a university course on it.
You taught a university course on hoarding?
No, I think there's a time when I did have a class that we were covering hoarding and I was teaching about it and thinking, I don't know what I'm talking about. So they didn't know that though, or they did. And I got good reviews, but
you kept the classroom very clean.
That's right. Here's what I'm wondering.
Very organized.
So how often would you say that happens? Because this is going to tie into our topic.
Where people just ask you like really broad sweep. Yeah. Yeah.
They assume that you are a therapist, so you know all things mental health. And how do you answer? Because I often will just find myself saying stuff because actually I believe I don't know very well. And I'll say something like that. But I also recognize you don't know at all.
Mm-hmm.
Or I shouldn't say it all, but they, it's like, well, look, I've gotten at least some training on this, so I can give you some answers. And I know general principles that relate to all humans, generally speaking, and all problems. So I can get at these things. But like, because I had something else come up recently that, someone asked me something and I was like, I don't really know. It's such a broad question. And really, I know you're asking for specific answers, but I'd have to see the specific case to know.
Mm-hmm.
So does it happen a lot? And what do you tell people? Do you just try to sound smart? Or you just be like, I don't know.
I guess it depends on the issue, but yeah, if I don't know, I'll oftentimes say I don't really work with that. Like you said, like I don't really have any specialized knowledge in that area, but I think asking people questions is sometimes more helpful.
Yeah.
Because I've found, at least when people come and ask questions like that, it's almost like they kind of already have some sense of what they want to do, and they just want to check it with somebody who's maybe more knowledgeable about that topic. Yeah. And so if you start saying things that, like I've had conversations where you start saying things just without asking questions, and that conflicts with something that they're already planning on doing, but they're like, well, wouldn't that just lead to this? Wouldn't that? And it's like, well, what are we doing? He asked me a question and I'm answering. So yeah, I think backing up and getting their thoughts on it first. And oftentimes I give kind of the really unsatisfying answer, right? Which is like, well, that really depends.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I think that is revealing too, because then sometimes people are like, oh yeah, I really just wanted to make this go away quick. And I don't like the fact that you're telling me that there's a whole lot more to it than what I'm thinking. And so the conversation just kind of naturally shifts. Like, oh, well, anyway, I'll figure it out. And then start talking about something else.
Oh, thanks. What do you say, Mike? Nothing?
I was going to say, I can think of a few times it's happened, where one time I think they were just curious. Like, here's this topic. I'm curious what, and the guy even said, he's like, you're an expert in this. And I was like, oh, geez.
I know it's hard to be like, no, I'm not.
Well, and then it was like such a broad question. I'm like, I don't even know what to do with that. Like it had something to do with like youth and or like teens and like media.
Hey, I think Mike
And
froze.
I'm like, we still like, we're pretty sure
Is
it's
he
not going to
talking?
be good. I didn't freeze. You froze.
It was you, Mike, or you, Rob, because your audio was super delayed. And
What the?
it's the host, dude. The
Anyway.
host has the most problems.
I gotta
Anyway,
keep
It's all
going.
on you. No, but it was like one of those really broad questions that like, you know, I'm like, we're still like, there's not a lot of research on it. I don't really know. Like it's nothing says it's good, but often I'll just kind of give the generic, like, here's what I know, but it just depends on the person. Like it's going to look different for everybody.
Yeah. How often do you guys get the feeling that people walk away from you disappointed with your answer?
Like 90% of the time.
in the like
In this scenario where they're just
not
asking
in
you-
therapy, just
No,
someone coming
yeah.
up to you.
Just someone coming up to
I
Oh.
I was talking about therapy.
Well, in that
I'm always
case-
disappointed with my therapy. I feel like, because here's where I was thinking, this is, I think one of the things I learned, I think I've talked about on here before, when I went, after I was like probably through my second year of my PhD, I went to go see a doctor for something. And I remember sitting there thinking, like he was saying, oh, okay, well, it could be this, or, you know, it could be this, or I remember thinking, oh, you don't know what you're doing either. Like here, I used to think like doctors knew it. And then I was like, oh, you don't understand what you're doing.
Mhm.
And I just had lunch with an attorney who said the same thing. She said, well, none of us actually know what we're doing. Everyone just thinks we do. And I actually was just listening to a revisionist history podcast on the way down here. And they were talking about this precedent that's been used for in the Supreme Court cases of gun control and gun laws, a thing against New York state gun laws that they had. And they used this one case of Sir John Knight, who in the 1600s in England, because it was the common law that was there that was brought over to us, and so that they're going that far back, he went into a church with guns blazing, even though that was very against the law at the time, common law. But then they didn't find him guilty. So it was like, here's precedent of where he had guns in possession despite this, and so therefore it should be okay. And then he said that case has been cited over and over and over and again until Malcolm Gladwell actually went over to England and said they have these records from then that said, actually, if you look at the whole picture, he followed all the laws of the land. He did not take his gun inside with him. He didn't do this. He didn't do this. And so the charge was never that he had his guns. It was actually that he was a bigot who hated Catholics. And they found it to be, you know, like we can't do anything about that. And so that's why he got off. But it's this whole, now I lost where I was even going with this because I got so lost in this. Oh, this idea.
You're talking about nobody knows what they're doing.
Yeah, nobody really knows where. So here's these attorneys who are arguing and in the Supreme Court and using a case incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe they'd say, no, we're not. But I feel like, I don't know, the records show that you are. So it's just kind of funny to me that when people come even to therapy, they have this thought. And I was looking this up and so the topic being, now that we're 45 minutes into this episode, I'm just kidding.
Okay. Jeez, dude, did I fall asleep?
The topic being, I guess we're going to say common misconceptions or misunderstandings about therapy /therapists /therapy techniques. That's a real truncated title. So I was checking this out on Psychology Today, and one of the things they have that I feel like is a good answer is this is a common myth. Psychotherapists or therapists have ready-made solutions for all of life's problems. And I think people sometimes come thinking, well, you have these answers. I'm like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I have my life experience, which includes a lot of education and includes a lot of experience working with these kinds of problems.
Yeah.
But even then, like when I went into the ER with my gallbladder thing, they were looking at me thinking, you don't fit any of the criteria we have for someone who has gallstones. So they just assumed apparently I was a giant wuss who just couldn't take my heartburn. And so they gave me the white they call it white lightning. It's not white lightning. It was just something to numb me out. And he's like, there, it feels better, right? It's like, not really. He's like, oh. So then they put me in a CAT scan or whatever. And he's like, oh, you have gallstones. It's like, well, he's just guessing. He just has to go off the information he has.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, in these situations, that's why you'd have to say, well, it depends. Like, so if someone says, hey, look, my brother's having these heart or these stomach pains.
Yeah.
And they're saying, okay, well, he's a male, he's in shape, he's this, he's this. They'd say, well, it's probably not gallstones. But in a case-by-case basis, it's like, oh, it was for him.
Well, I'll put in a plug here for private practice. Because I think like the examples you're using, and maybe this could apply to mental health too, but or anything that where you have any sort of bureaucracy whose key performance indicators really don't align with like actually providing helpful services.
Yeah.
It's more like, your job is to diagnose quickly, perform some procedure that we can bill for, and then get the person out. So really that doctor nailed it, dude. He performed 2 procedures on you that really like is going to look good to the higher ups. But like, I think when you think about, and I guess it could go both ways. Cause if somebody's coming to you and saying, I'm paying out of pocket for this, and this is what I expect, is that you will have some sort of like, you'll coach me. Right. And I think that like somebody's ability to really be coached has a lot to do with where they're at in the change process. Cause I have worked with people where I would say that's exactly what they're asking for.
Right.
And when I approach it that way, it does end up being really helpful. Whereas other people that are saying, maybe they're saying, I want to figure out how to do X, but that's their best attempt at saying, I really don't like where I'm at, but I haven't really quite figured out what that is yet. So if you hand me some tool to accomplish X, I'm not going to know what to do with it, or I'm going to push it aside because my bigger issue is like, what's going on for me, right? And do I even want things to be different when I really weigh out all the, pros and cons of the change that would be required to get me out of this place? And some people end up deciding that place, you know what, I think I'm actually good, right?
Yeah.
And those are the situations that we've talked about before, where as a therapist, your role is more to kind of say like, you're okay. Like there's really not anything going on for you that, you're not saying like your problem isn't difficult, but you're saying like, you're actually maybe more normal than you think, right? Yeah. Like this is, so you're kind of adjusting.
That's what I say.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it really depends on where the person's at, because I wouldn't say that that's a total myth, meaning like a therapist has some really valuable things to even teach you. Right. I think depending on where you're at and what you're ready for and what you're dealing with, that can be super helpful information. But again, it's like somebody who's in a position of feeling really stuck, obviously is going to think there's got to be like a quick way to get out of this, because who wouldn't want a quick way out of a difficult situation? Right. But that's not going to be, that interaction's not going to go as well as it would with somebody who's really ready for that change.
Yeah. Like I had a couple, and then we'll have to move into some of these specific things that I know, Mike, you mentioned a couple I want to get into that I think are interesting, but I had a couple who came in just the other day that said, basically, we're here to work on this one specific issue. And I was like, okay, so as I'm asking around, there's some secrecy and lying in this issue. And they said, we just need to know how to talk about this. Everything else is really great. And I was like, great. That's great. I can see you guys have a good foundation, but we have to kind of dig into why it was that you were lying about this issue. Like, there's something deeper to understand. And I don't think they like that. I think they're like, no, just tell us like how to use the right words. And I felt like the motivation underneath is too big. And I recognize that for some people, it's like, that's how I work. Yeah. And if that's not what you're looking for, don't work with me. Because I know I won't be satisfied with just the topic. But go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was going to say there are actually like models of therapy where like
solution focused.
Yeah. Like we're going to give you this very specific problem, solve that very specific problem, and we're back out.
And even, even like with strategic would say, we're going to solve that specific problem by solving the way you guys interact without you knowing it. but we're really just taking care of the topic you showed up with. And so people like that idea. Plus there's a whole idea too that managed care has altered the way we do therapy, because there is like, what outcomes will you get within 10 to 12 sessions? Because that's what we'll cover. So it does alter the way what people expect, because they don't want to have to pay out of pocket, although all three of us have set our practices up to be private pay. So I think people know some of that when we come up, when they start with us. But I think that's one of the first and biggest misconceptions I see, that I feel like, no, that's not what this means, and that's not like what you should expect from me or this process. But if we said, because I think there are some people who, like I have another client where they basically have said to their spouse that I see, this isn't working because you're not doing this specific thing. Tell Rob this isn't working. He should be doing this and this. Basically saying you need to go to therapy and get fixed and then come back, which is a horrible misuse of therapy. And actually, I think why a lot of men in particular don't want to go to therapy, because whether it's directly spoken or not, they all know we're in therapy to fix me. It's like we're in couples therapy, it's to fix me. Even though everyone's like, no. But if you ask him, like, does it feel like this? And he'll be like, yeah, totally. And he'll be like, but in fairness, I am the problem. I'm like, no, you're not the problem. So what are some things that you guys would feel like, because you guys mentioned a few, what are some things that you guys would feel like these are things that are either misconceptions or things that you would like to take today to say, I'm going to educate the world so we never have this problem coming up in therapy anymore?
Go for it, Mike. Swing for the fences.
The one that has come up. I mean, it's, you guys know because we talked about it. It's one I'm dealing with right now, but it's come up.
What is it, Mike? The suspense is killing me.
I know, right? It's come up in a couple of other sessions too, and it's a huge thing that we spend a lot of time talking about in general, is boundaries, and what they look like and what they're for, and how you implement and successfully. And like the best example I can think of is there's someone that I've worked with, and they'll sit and talk about, like, I've got my boundaries, and I'm like, great. And then they'll talk to me about how they explain those boundaries to their significant other. Well, I tell them, you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you can't do this. And I said, that's not boundaries, dude.
And they'll say, what do I do when they won't keep the boundaries?
Right. And I'm like, okay. And so that's, like, to me, that's one of the biggest misconceptions. And I spend a lot of time reminding people, boundaries aren't for other people. They're for you. It's not you dictating what someone else is going to do or is allowed to do. It's you dictating what you're going to do. Because that one, I think,
that one
comes up a lot.
Well, that one's funny. I feel like that's one where you can, with your clients, you can suddenly feel like, man, my clients think I'm a genius, because I'll be like, well, no, boundaries are for you. So that if you feel like you're saying, if this occurs and I feel unsafe, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
Which usually means I'm going to separate myself for a time or meditate or whatever, so I can calm myself back down and then re-engage. And whenever I say that, clients are always like, whoa. And I feel like, yeah, I didn't make that up. It's not, I wish I could take credit for that, but that's just what boundaries are. But that's a good one that I think happens a ton of people not knowing that this is not, like, therapy is not for somebody else, for lack of a better way to put that. I'm trying to remember, Matt. I have this list here, and I have knowing. Why did I write the word knowing?
I don't remember. I've got two things though. Like,
I don't know, Rob. That sounds dumb and boring. Let's move on to the next thing.
no. Like when you're saying you're thinking you wrote down things that I talked about before that were mine.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know if this is the same that's on your list. That's what I'm saying.
It's a good example of what happens.
Oh, yeah. No, I know what you're talking about now.
Okay.
I'll throw that in there. I think the first one I would actually say to therapists, that myself included, I think sometimes we're really unaware of what is actually happening in therapy, like
Mm.
what's actually helpful and meaningful to our clients. We do ask, is this helping, right? But
Yeah.
I don't want to say we don't ask, but maybe it's rare sometimes to ask, what is it about this process that's helping? Because we kind of assume that maybe we know what that is. Like we're saying, what do you want to improve for you in therapy? And our client tells us that. And then we say, okay, so as long as that's improving, it's because of what we're doing, that has to do with whatever approach to therapy I'm using or whatever my training is about. But I did a training when I was in my master's program with David Burns. I think that's his name. It's been so long. He's the guy that wrote like Feeling Good and did all the CBT stuff for depression and anxiety and stuff.
Oh, it's not.
And he had these questionnaires that he had developed that I don't know much about like the sample size or anything like that, but I know he widely distributed these questionnaires to clients and then to therapists. What he found was like we as therapists in that situation anyway are like have a strong tendency to overemphasize the strength of our relationship with our clients and our helpfulness. So we have a bent to kind of think like, if it's working, it's because what I'm doing and what we're doing in the room is, working. But like we've talked about before, oftentimes when you really ask your client what's helpful to you about this process, it's oftentimes a lot more simple than we make it. It's like, well, I get to sit here and really, if you think about the rarity of a conversation like the ones we help clients have, I think it puts this in perspective, right? Like where in the world does anybody have a situation where they sit down with somebody who's not going to share anything about that information with anybody else, and the conversation is inherently one-sided on purpose?
Yeah.
Like that just in and of itself, like what's the impact of that, right? So I think sometimes we get hard on ourselves as therapists, like, oh man, I'm not doing this well enough. I'm not doing it. But like, I think asking your client specifically, what is it about this that's actually working? So that we can do more of that and really understanding, yes, your client has a direction they've pointed themselves in. They've said, I want to get to here with such and such a problem. And they may say, this is helpful or this isn't helpful, right? I think I've had sessions where I've left thinking, man, that was like the best session I ever did. And then the next session, the client's like, that was the worst session I've ever had. And I'm like, whoa, like I totally missed something. What? Tell me about it. Right. So I think for therapists, that's maybe a misconception. And then
That's funny.
for clients, I think the knowing, I think that and especially like in the information age, I think we think that knowledge automatically converts to wisdom, right? Or like experience or change or all of these things, right? And that's our biggest go-to in parenting, and the least effective way to parent is lecturing, right? But that's the thing we go to all the time. Like modeling and experiences are clearly where change actually happens. But I think that we can think about change as like, if I know what to do, like that's what I was saying, I guess earlier, is like knowing is half the battle, when I'm like, I think it's actually about 10%. Right. And you can get really addicted to that 10% of insight, and you can keep coming back to a change process to like, look at things differently, look at things differently, look at things differently. And it feels like you're making progress. But if you don't actually experience that knowledge kind of creating an experience for you that changes something, or experience it between you and somebody else. And that's where knowledge, I think, sometimes is really experiential. It's like, oh, I had no idea that my partner actually thought that. I thought they were thinking this. And now that I know that, that changes a lot, right? So I think information and knowledge is really important. But if it doesn't get down to an experience for you, it will kind of like the flame of that insight will die down, and then you'll need another insight, and then it'll die down and you'll need another insight. It's like, that's what kind of like starts the hope of change. But if it doesn't materialize into, not necessarily like into changed behavior, and that's where I think the misconception is, well, you know what to do, why aren't you doing it? And it's like, there's a lot of reasons why people don't do what they know they should do, right? And And most people that come into therapy, or a lot, I'll say, they know what to do. They just don't know why they're not doing it and like what's in the way. And so telling somebody what to do, most people will be like, yeah, I know. Right. Or they'll say, no, that's dumb. That doesn't work for me. Right. Well, is it the truth and the knowledge that didn't work? Or is it like something along the way in your application of it that broke down that we need to figure out? And I think, like you're saying, people that are outside the room oftentimes weigh in, you need to be talking about this and you need to be saying this. And it's like, well, come in here and watch me do it and see what happens. Right. It's like, that's not the conversation we're having. So yeah.
That's you're describing. Oh, sorry, Mike, you want to speak?
No, it's cool. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Because you're describing, Matt, this thing that I like to call, as of right now, chasing the Oprah dragon.
Does it have heartburn?
Always does. So because, Oprah, I always call them to clients Oprah's aha moments, where I don't remember who told me about this a long time ago. Oprah would be like, oh, and people are like, oh, once you have this realization with Oprah, then it's like everything changes.
Oh.
And I used to tell people it doesn't change things for most people. It just like that's a part of it. But you do end up, I have some clients who've gotten stuck in this kind of like spiral downhill, I'd say, of like they're always gaining new insight and information and never doing anything with it.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that, we've said before, therapists don't give advice because we don't. Too many people already hear advice.
Yeah.
And so most of the time my job is saying, did you look at it like this and like this? And then we can start to figure out, why aren't you doing these things?
Mm-hmm.
But it does lead me into that space of going to that same thing where it says they think we have this ready-made answer, that sometimes I do end up saying, well, you do it. Like, because when people
How
say,
do you do it?
like people will say like, how do I tell them this? And part of my job is to say, I need you to understand first what you're actually trying to tell them. Like if you're trying to tell them you look fat in those pants, you don't need to bother with that.
Yeah.
Like that's not being honest. Being honest would be saying, I feel threatened because you look fat in those pants. I was trying to keep the theme going, but just like the threatened part is like, you can tell them that. And then they're like, well, how do I tell them? And I say, are you asking me, how do I tell them so that it doesn't have blowback on you, so that it doesn't hurt? They're like, yeah. I'm like, I don't have that. That doesn't exist. I need you to go and know it's okay to be hurt. Like, just go do those things. But I do think I want you to know the right things, because just knowing it, like, it's valuable to know, oh, I didn't know my partner, my spouse felt like that. That hopefully then could say, okay, so then I want to approach like this. If I'm seeing them in a different light, then I want to approach differently. But it's never enough to say, yeah, I know they're feeling like that.
Yeah.
But then what? So you do have to mix in the behavioral components with aha moments. Like I had one client in the second session, he said, you said this thing last time and it was just really this kind of nugget. And I feel like if you can just give me a nugget each time. And I said, no, I can't. I was like, eventually I'm going to run out of nuggets, man. I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, Mike, what were you going to say?
Well, it's just the idea of knowing, right? Like I've become aware over the last year and a half, and probably longer than that a little bit, but of my depression and the severity and how long I've dealt with it, longer than I thought I had, for sure. And like I've been going through for the last few weeks, where my depression's just been a little more active, which means I'm a little less active. I
think it's because you moved to Kansas City and left us here.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Anyway,
I've made a huge mistake.
not to put too fine a point on it. No, but it's one of those where, like there's some things and Jenner asked me like, well, why? Like, why didn't you do something? And I was like, because I was freaking depressed. That's why. And I thought,
uncompassionate.
I thought that's the worst answer ever. Like, it's great that I know I'm depressed. So what? Like, and I've asked this to some clients because they're like, but I struggle with social anxiety. So what? Which sounds pretty harsh.
I don't care. Get out there, yeah.
But it's one of those where they just want to keep, like, that becomes the de facto, like, I don't, like, that explains everything.
Well, yeah,
like,
when
no,
it becomes
it doesn't explain anything.
not just an explanation, but a reason that therefore I can't.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Like I know the reason that I've been slow to respond to texts. Yeah. It's it's very much a symptom of my depression. Like when I get quieter in text threads, when I like anything like that, yeah, chances are something's a little off. And so like I know why I do it. That knowledge doesn't do a thing for me unless I'm looking and saying, all right, but what am I going to do about it? And so it is like, and I've challenged some of my clients with this. Like, one person I said, "What if it's not social anxiety?" And she's like, "But it is." I said, "I'm not saying it's." I said, "It is, but what if it's not?"
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are you going to explain these things? How are you going to? What are you going to do about them? If it's
Then she
not
stopped
that,
seeing
then
you.
no.
I'm just kidding.
She did not.
So yeah, I do think that idea of like we do put so much stock in the knowing aspect of it.
I think
I just need to, and then even to take it to your point, like I had this conversation with a guy a couple of weeks ago where he was going through something and I think I might have mentioned this last week or the week before, but he said to me, he's like, Mike, like, how do I get around this? And I was like, get around. And he goes, well, I don't want to hurt her. How do I get around this?
Meaning,
like,
how do
"You
I
don't."
say or?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, you don't, dude. There's the thing you're talking about is going to hurt. I can promise you it's going to cause her pain. And there's no way around it. You just have to go through it. Which he didn't love my answer because he was looking for, just tell me the 5 steps I need to follow to make this go away and come out on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that, just say it. And then go from there. Because yeah, we can't, like, sometimes, like we've said before, it's just going to hurt.
Yeah, I do think too, like I don't want to leave anybody thinking that insight isn't helpful, right?
Oh, no, of course it is.
Oh, it super
I think-
is.
I think what we're saying too is like change occurs, generally speaking, very slowly, and incrementally, and we are addicted to massive, instantaneous, and like super impactful change stories. So I think we all hope for that, but really, I don't think that we're incapable of those moments because obviously they do occur. But the amount of like freedom from attachment to the things that you just inevitably give up when you make a change like that is the thing that keeps most of us from making change like that. So, like, if I were to say, I'm ready to just like do a 180, like, not a 360, guys.
That's the thing about my students. This changed
Dude,
me.
you
I
did
didn't,
like a total 360.
I didn't just do a 180. I did a total 360. I'm like, so I did nothing for you in this class?
So I think that if you can make that kind of change, right, it means that you're probably like having like a rip the band-aid off type of a moment, right, or something so powerful that you can't deny that you're going to head in a different direction. And I think that happens, but there's still a ton of maintenance and like cutting the ties of all the things that would pull you back, right? There's still like a long process. It's more like I changed my direction overnight. Okay. And then maybe the maintenance, is an ongoing process. So, but before that, I think like the slow accumulation of insight does create a tipping point, right? Where it's like, I need to just like the voice in my head is so strong, or the voices around me are so strong that I have to, do life this way. And you, therapist, are one conversation in my life that starts to say, well, what if this, right? What if that? Like, based on something that you, the client, have said, right? It's not like some therapist is like, well, I think all those people in your life are wrong. And I think, that's not what a therapist should be doing, right? Therapist should be listening to you and saying, it sounds like to me like this. Is that right? Right? It sounds like you're thinking about things more like this, but something in you maybe is stuck in old ways of being, right? So like the slow accumulation of those conversations, reminders, insight, I think does like build up to a tipping point of courage. But even then, it's like that's your first attempt at behavior change then, right?
Right.
And that's going to have big blowback. And I also think that sometimes when we set about creating any sort of change, we think, in order for me to feel what I need to feel, I need to be at the complete opposite end of this in a positive direction, right? Like I need to turn around and I need to be like 50 miles down the road. That's when I get to feel happy. And it's like, I think you'll feel better than you think you will as soon as you turn around, right? But don't mistake that for like
Arrival.
as like a permanent destination. You got to keep walking, but that's part of what helps you keep the momentum is like I feel the difference, right? And it feels like I'm heading in the right direction. And but I wish we just highlighted more how change actually occurs and celebrated a bit more of those like small victories.
That's like to this idea of like this slow accumulation of insight, of knowledge. That's one of the other issues that I kind of run into when I'm working with teenage clients and their parents. Is their parents are expecting change, and they'll come to me and be like, "Well, did they tell you about this?" And I'm like, "No." And
teenagers are so rough that way because parents want you to change their kid.
Yeah.
Well, and I have to, like, a lot of it with parents is I'm like, look, I can only work with what they give me. If they're like, if they don't see this behavior as a problem, they're not going to bring it up in here. And I can bring it up, but they're going to dismiss it because they don't think it's a problem. I can't force them to think it's a problem. I can ask questions and try to get them to see it from another perspective, which is what I do. But like ultimately I've had kids where it doesn't matter how often I try to get them to see their behavior as problematic and how many different angles I take, the kid just thinks it's fine. And I'm like, okay, well, then I can't force him to do it. And it's that idea of like, we can only work with what we're given. And that's where I think the insight and the knowledge becomes so helpful, is because the more we understand it, like it has been extremely beneficial for me to actually understand the depression. One, because I'm not as hard on myself about certain things as I have been in the past, because I understand that it's coming from something that's outside my control. And so there tends to be less beat up about it. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, I forgot.
Is clearly gone.
Yep.
I do think actually, again, to reinforce what you're saying, Matt, of course, we're not saying insight isn't valuable. It's very valuable. It's a part of, to me, it is a part of any process. If you're really going to make any significant changes, even the insight of saying, I need to go get help. But actually, I think what matters most in therapy, what I wish people understood most, is the idea that, like therapy is a process of saying, I'm coming in to change and I'm using this person to help me do this. Even if you're saying, I don't know all the ways I need to change, I only know what the problem is. And I think that what you're describing, Matt, that sometimes just that trajectory shift, you can change your direction overnight, I think is extremely valuable. I have a client just recently where we talked about like kind of the massive progress that he has made, despite the fact that the problem that he came in for is actually still a problem, if that makes sense. But there's been so much shifting around the way, like what he now views as the kind of the root of this thing and what really is the actual problem for him, that he feels like he's making this massive progress in this direction that, and I keep saying massive, but actually if you looked at it, if you observed him, you'd think it's very minor, but it feels so monumental to him. And that's, I think you're right to say, we have to be able to highlight to somebody, this is actually very big change. Another client came in just like yesterday, like super excited, telling me how they just said this one thing a little bit differently in this conversation with their spouse. And they were like, are you proud of me? And I was like, yes, because that is actually pretty significant, because they had started to see things in a different way which was shifting their behavior. And I think that comes back to that insight place. But in the end, still, like I think because too mental health mixes with, it's so mixed now with meds that a lot of people assume that any therapist can give meds, which only MDs or psychiatrists can give meds, at least in Texas. I don't know if that's changed in any other states, but and in most states, I should say. But also, even with meds, I have to clarify to people: meds don't take you from like 0 to 75 or 80. Meds take you from 0 to 10%, and 10% is more workable. Like you can say, okay, now I'm seeing things, I feel more engaged, and you know the 10% varies by person, but you're signing up to work, but gaining insight and outside perspective of like, oh, I didn't see it that way. And Matt, you mentioned at the beginning of this that if people could really understand that one of the most important factors in any therapy is, do you actually desire some sort of change? Because if you don't, and it does specifically for yourself, because if you don't, therapy is not going to work. If you desire change for somebody else, don't bother coming to therapy unless you're willing to change yourself in that to get that. And even then, I think that's a terrible motivation. But
Yeah.
But that's my, like, I guess my thing that I wish people understood most. And actually, I guess I'm stealing that from you, Matt, because I hadn't thought of it that way. But to say, I wish they could see. I've had some clients who have had the same insight. One client said, "You've said this 6 times, and it somehow is resonating differently each time." And I think that's because that is the nature of progression and change. Is that as you keep hearing things, you keep molding new pathways and keep shifting. And so it'll resonate differently each time I say it. And if that's coupled with efforts that you're making outside of here to attempt things, even if they go wrong, to kind of understand yourself better, then you move forward in a much better direction just because you're trying hard to figure out, how do I become different?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's like, I love the idea of celebrating the small changes. And I'll often, when I'm working with couples in particular, will, put it in aspect of time. Like a lot of the behavior patterns and the communication patterns that get established very early in the relationship. And so they're coming to me sometimes with 15, 20, 25 years of this pattern. And I'm like, yeah, you're trying to undo 20 years of habit. That's not going to go easy.
Right.
And so, yeah, does it sound like it's coming out of a playbook? Does it sound like he's just running a checklist? Probably. But he's running a checklist before he wasn't doing any of that. So that's a step in the direction that you want it to go. And it's like I have to remind myself of that. I'm 46 years old. A lot of the things that I do, I've been doing for well over 25, 30 years. And I think, yeah, if I'm going to change them, it's going to take consistent effort, and it's just not going to come easy.
I think one other selfish plug I have before I guess we can be done and go to the drink store is thinking, I had another couple I sat with recently, and I said, they were talking about how frequently they have sex. And I said, well, are you guys, it was like once every 2 to 3 months. And I said, are you guys both okay with that? And they're like, yeah, actually it seems like it's working pretty well for us. But we know that healthy couples are supposed to have sex more often. And I said, no, healthy couples just need to be on the same page with each other, like around sex. So if you guys can talk about it and you're having it as frequently as you both want it, and you can bring it up, and then great. You don't have to have it more than that if it's meeting your needs. And it was like this revolutionary moment. They're like, oh, so there's not like a level, like they kept comparing themselves to like, well, we should be doing this. And I think, who says who? Like all these things we have. I mean, there's 80 million self-help books that say this is what you should do. And I was like, well, like, the parenting thing with my kid, where I said, I'm not really one for, I didn't say it this way, but I'm not really one for like, okay, here's this consequence. Then somebody else would look and say, well, then you're doing a bad job parenting. And it feels like, I don't think I am. I just have a different approach to this. And so I don't want to compare myself to what that is, because it makes me feel like I'm not doing things well when this feels like it's working for me. So if it's working for you, but you're comparing it to somebody else, then let that go. Not that that's my final thought, but that was just one last selfish plug. Does anybody else have any final thoughts?
Well, and as one of our YouTube commenters
Bunch of fruits.
mentioned to us, it is the devil who leads us down these paths of self-help.
Self-help. That was so awesome.
No, I don't know where we're at time-wise, but
55 minutes.
Well, we might spill over.
Oh,
I was curious, Mike, when you're thinking about like the accumulation of insight and knowledge about your depression, like what impact would you say that has had? And I'm sure you've had some changes in behavior as a result, right? But like, obviously, like you said, it still can take me out every now and then, right? Like, so just knowing about it doesn't solve it, right? But like, what impact has like learning about it? Because I think for a lot of our listeners, I think it is important to like figure out what are the challenges that you have in life and learn about them, right? But maybe don't expect that learning about it is going to make it go away, right? But there is benefit to learning about it. So what would you say?
I think for me, two of the biggest things, one of them I already mentioned, is I tend to not beat myself up as much. One of the things that happens for me, and the more I work with men in particular, I think this is often how depression manifests for them, but I've seen it in a lot of women as well. The little voice in my head gets insanely critical. Don't tell. Gets really critical when my depression kicks up. And so like I would get down on myself a lot because, like that's when I would be more likely to just devalue myself in general. Like they don't want me here. They're just tolerating me. These are all things that voice would just kind of start working on. And that was like mine didn't necessarily show up as sadness. Like that's another common misconception, right? Is that depression is sadness. And mine doesn't. Like people wouldn't see me and think I'm sad, but I got this voice in my head that won't shut up. And so recognizing it and knowing helps me see it and recognize it for what it is. That like, yeah, I'm more prone to it right now. And I know I'm more prone to it. And so sometimes I'll talk it out with Jenner just because sometimes it's too much and I can't. Like trying to talk myself down from it doesn't really work. And so I'll talk it through with her. That's the other thing kind of goes along with that is it kind of helps me recognize, like I've learned different behaviors that show up more frequently and consistently when my depression is active. And so it helps me kind of recognize like, oh, I can feel myself slipping. And so I need to start doing things that will kind of, at a minimum, keep me from sliding further. Like like that's this week has been a lot of, I just need to not slide further. Like I'm not pulling myself out this week. I mean, I might be, we're only halfway through, but like I knew like, no, but I need to not slide further. I got to stay functional. And so I forced myself to do things that I don't want to do because it
like
keeps
the
me
Manspace.
functional.
Yeah.
No, this is always a huge.
I'm just kidding.
I know. This is always one of those get to things. But no, like just like I had, a couple of emails to send, and that's again like when my depression gets bad, that's emails go out the door. And so I just kind of forced myself. I said, look, like I'm not going to sit and do all of them because it felt like a monstrous. I think it was like 4 emails, but it felt like so many. I was like, I'm not doing all of them, but I'll do one of them. Right. And so it was one of those where forcing myself to do these things to keep myself from sliding further. Recognizing those has made that possible. Right. Because otherwise, by the time I would catch it, like I would often catch it 3 or 4 days after my wife had noticed it. And I'd say, I think my depression's not great right now. And she's like, yeah, like 3 days ago. And I was like, what? Like, I'm just seeing it.
Yeah.
But so learning to recognize these different patterns that exist for me, right? They're going to be different for everybody. And that's where spending that time and, you know, when you're working in particular with a therapist, when they, you know, like I'll often ask clients, like, what does it look like for you? It's because I'm trying to figure out, like, what are the behaviors that show up consistently? Because those are the things that you need to start watching for. Because those are the things that are going to help you not slide so far every time. And so I think for me, that's kind of been the two biggest things of just kind of recognizing it. And I mean, just from a strictly curiosity standpoint, it explains a lot of high school.
Like your high school or just high school in general?
Like my high school experience.
Oh,
Like I look back at some things I did and I'm like, oh my gosh. And then I'm like, oh yeah, okay. Like knowing what I know now, I'm like, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it. Before it fell out of character for me. But, you know, but apparently it was me because it's what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
But looking back, I think, oh no, it wasn't. It was just how my depression would show up.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Good insights.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I do think, like, when you talk about, you know, just the narrative that's going on in our minds, like insight and the beginning stages of change, I think really just help you change. It's like you're changing the relationship with that problem in the place that it exists most frequently, which is in your head, right? And so if you start to kind of like get into the right position with the problem, oftentimes that's when some of those behavioral changes come, right? And some would argue that it happens the other way, right? Just kind of like do it and then the story will change and like the relationship change in your mind will follow. And I think that happens for people too. But yeah, one thing that when you're talking about like just getting yourself to do little things, I think this is like the dumbest thing, but to use a tool here, right? Like this little guy right here, this little timer, right? For me,
Yeah.
it's like,
I'm just staring at that, wondering what that is.
it is like a game changer, not in and of itself, right? But like it's got little, basically you just set it down on the number of minutes you want to set the timer for. So there's like 3, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 45, and 60. But there's something about it for me that like when I am about to engage in something that just feels like, oh my gosh, right? But it's
Right.
like really on the surface, it's really not that hard.
Right.
If I just commit myself to like 3 minutes, you know, like anybody can do something hard for 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And the reason I say it's dumb is that I shouldn't be dumb enough to be tricked by a timer. And I could beat myself up by saying like, what's wrong with you? You should be able just to initiate this on your own. But the truth is, if I just look at it, you know, objectively, when I set that thing, like I am extremely productive. And like with each, and on top of that, when I mandate like okay, you've worked for this period of time, you absolutely have to get up for 5 minutes and do something different, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got to take a break, because the problem, I think, for a lot of life is like getting stuck in one position. And when you have like frequent changes like this, your relationship with the problem or with the solution becomes less sticky, right? And so I'm not attached to either one of them. I can transition back and forth, and I've got the freedom to kind of like dictate how I move with this. And something as simple as a little timer for me helps me practice those transitions, right? Jump in, you know, engage with it, jump out, jump in, engage with it, jump out. Right.
Yeah.
And although it is centered around like tasks and productivity, I think there's a larger lesson like in life. Like life is a rhythm of jumping in and jumping out and jumping in and jumping out. And we just get stuck in one position. And that oftentimes creates a lot of the problems we describe, right? Like I'm just totally stuck in disengagement and avoidance. And now the thought of getting involved is like way too much, right? It's my social anxiety, it's my depression, it's whatever, right? And not that those aren't part of the problem. I'm not saying that, but then, we've worked with tons of people that are just completely locked into like engage, and they burn out and they blow up on people and they, and if you ask them to just step back, it's like, whoa, I can't do that. Like I can't sit still because when I sit still, this attacks me. Right.
Yeah.
And I think same thing. It's just the back and forth is really hard.
I think one other thing that's interesting that I think is valuable about the therapy process that I think sometimes people overlook is sometimes my interns will be like, well, you're not supposed to share stuff about yourself. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, relatively speaking, I'm not supposed to go in there and be like, hey, look, guys, I've been going through some stuff with my wife. I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts on what this is,
Help me out.
But I think, I mean, essentially what you just did there, Matt, is a therapeutic technique in and of itself. You didn't like, you're seeing where Mike is and Mike's describing this thing and saying, oh yeah, here's something that has been helpful to me. Mm-hmm. You're not saying this is necessarily like, this is what everyone should do, or this will be helpful to you, but you are saying, here are some principles behind this that they may be helpful. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think that's the part where it's like, when people think, well, aren't you here to tell me what to do? It's like, not really. I can tell you what I've done. And that's what the knowledge doesn't equal wisdom.
Yeah.
Like there are plenty of therapists I know who know lots of stuff, but they don't have a lot of quote unquote wisdom. And I'm not saying I do either, but it's kind of like, well, I mean, if I watch the way you live your life, I don't think I want to model myself after what you're doing. But when you describe your stuff, man, I'm like, oh yeah, I should get one of those timers. This sounds like a good idea. Like only because it was kind of this mutual sharing. Like there's those theorists who refer to this as the existential encounter of like you and I will both become different people because we've engaged in this process together.
Yeah.
And there's been tons of times I've said on this show before where it's like, I'm sitting there talking to somebody. I'm like, I'll say something. And I'll think, and I will say out loud, oh, that was for me. Yeah. I think my client's like, wait, what?
It is funny though, man, because this timer sits here all the time. And even knowing what I know and having the experience that I've had, it's like there are plenty of days where I sit there and look at that timer. I'm like, you're not going to tell me what to do.
I know. Screw you, timer.
Well, that's like that. The interesting thing about that, I think, is like, one, I really appreciated it. I've actually, like, I call it with my clients the 5-minute rule or the 10-minute rule. Right. When you have a task you don't want to do, just engage for 5 minutes. Usually that's enough to get the brain started. And I said at the end of 5 minutes, you don't want to, you quit. It's fine. And so like, it was familiar to me and I appreciated it, but like the timer was a aspect I hadn't.
Right.
The inadvertent thing that happened as Matt was kind of explaining it and sharing it is I immediately felt less isolated.
Yeah.
Because suddenly I know, I'm not the only one this happens for.
Right.
Which logically, again, I know. But as I'm sitting here talking and as I'm sitting here talking about these things, I think, I'm watching you two and I think, yeah, this is apparently just a me thing.
No. And I just cover it really well. Mine comes out in the form of heartburn. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's valuable when we started this about normalizing. I'm saying, actually, this happens to lots of people, but I think it's different to hear your therapist say, oh, yeah, this is what it looks like for me. This is one of the things that I do. Because then it's like, oh, that's why with clients, when I'll be like, man, have you thought about killing yourself? And people are like, what? I'm like, it's only because I'm trying to say to them, dude, if I was in your shoes, I might be thinking this.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they're thinking, okay, cool. Then I can talk about this because I'm not the only person who would think this.
Right.
So I think there's a lot valuable that hopefully, actually, after this episode, I think hopefully people will be like, oh, maybe I will go see a therapist. Like your therapy can honestly be whatever you want it to be, really.
Yeah.
Unless depending on the therapist you get, I guess I get, but I can't speak English anymore. So apparently it's time to wrap it up because it's an hour and 10 minutes.
It's old school.
We lost people 15 minutes ago. Well, then catch us next time on the Manspace. Helpful.